Redux and state management. In this video, we are going to set up a Redux store for the application. So if Redux store, Redux toolkit, slices, reducers, these things confuse you, don't worry. I'll be explaining everything in detail. So code along with me, and by the end of this video, we'll have our Redux store set up for the application.
So let's get started with the second part of the video. So as you can see, I have an assets folder here where I have downloaded all the assets that I need. So I'll just increase the size so that you can see. So these are the assets that I am using in my application. You can download them from the websites I showed you in the previous video. So for that, I'll just quickly create an assets folder, which I did in the first video. And I'll create two folders inside this. One is images and the second one is icons. So icons, okay, it's not a file actually, it's a folder. I'll just delete this. Inside my assets, it's icons. So I have these two folders here. So now inside these two folders, I'll quickly copy my assets. So I'll go here and I'll close this so that I have to remove the size. Since all of them are images except for one, what I'll do is I'll go to Tripify, I'll go to assets, and then inside the images I'll paste it, and this is the icon that I have, which is just a back icon. I'll just cut this, keep it here, go back inside my icon, I'll just paste it. Now since I have images and the icons ready, I just have to do one more thing. As you can see, these numbered JPEGs, these are the banners that I'll be using for each of the trip. So what I'll do here, I'll create one more folder inside this called trips thumbnails, right? And inside this trips thumbnail, I'll just copy all of these 10 thumbnails that we have. So these 10 thumbnails will go inside this folder. So now we have trips thumbnail with all the trip thumbnails. So I'll create a new file inside assets, which is assets.js. So what this will do, this will export the URL for each of the local image that I have. So what I'll create another object, which is export const images. So in my application, I have certain images which I'll be exporting from here, and again export const icons. In my application, all the icons will be exported from here. Since I have just one icon, I'll quickly export it. Just write require. In React Native, you have to use require here, and the relative path, which is icons back.png. So yep, I have exported the icon, and finally export const thumbnails for all the thumbnails that we have. Thumbnails. So we have 10 thumbnails right now. So for each of this, since it's an object, I'm not going to name something. I'll just give it a number. Let's say number 1 is require back images and then trip thumbnails 1.png. And similarly, I'll just copy this particular line, and for 2, this will be 2.png. For 3, this will be 3.png. I'll save this. For 4, this will be 4.png. For 5, this will be 5.png. I'll save this. I'll copy this again. I'll paste it. So for 6, this is 6.png. For 7, this is 7.png. For 8, this is 8.png. For 9, this is 9.png. And for the last one that we have, 10, this is 10.png. So we have 10 images, 10 thumbnails. I have exported them all, and we have just 4 images. I'll just say the first one is the Tripify banner that I showed you in the demo, the first banner that we see on the home screen. Let's say Tripify banner. So I'll say require, go to my images folder, and the name is Tripify banner 1. Tripify images, and then Tripify banner 1.png. So my banner is exported here. Next one is I'll export the rest of the images whenever they are needed. So right now in this video, as I told you in the beginning, what we're going to do, we are going to integrate Redux into our application. So what Redux is, I'll quickly open the Redux documentation. Redux, as you can see here, it's predictable, it's centralized, it's debuggable, and it's flexible. So take an example. Suppose on an application, on a particular screen, I entered my name, and if I went to the next screen, my state of my name will be lost. A variable will be holding my name, but the moment I change the screen, the value will be lost. So this happens inside our application. But to maintain that state, we need some state management tool. Also, suppose there is a child component and a child component and their child component. So we can't just pass props. In React, we pass props to the child component. But to what level? Let's say so my name has to be passed to my identity. And let's say there is an application in my college which contains the data of my department. So my name is passed from the data of my college to the data of my department, from my department to my branch, from my branch to my year, from my year to my particular batch. So as you can see that it is traversing a lot of levels. So this is known as prop drilling. So if you just Google prop drilling, let's say prop drilling, you will understand prop drilling in React. So you'll understand what prop drilling is. I'll just quickly show you an image if there is any. Yes, you can see from parent to child A to child B to child C. To remove all these complexities inside an application, we use a state container, and the best one that we use is Redux. So we'll get started with Redux here. So now Redux officially encourages us to use Redux toolkit. So we'll go to Redux toolkit. We'll just go to Redux toolkit installation. Now, since we have an existing app, we'll just copy this particular line. And as I told you, wherever you are starting your application, make sure you are closing the current running file. I'll just close this folder. So by Command C, this is closed. I'll close this metro. Yeah. Now I'll install the Redux toolkit. The second thing that we need here is, so to understand this, if you have used Redux before, what Redux toolkit is, it simplifies the entire logic for you. So if you have experienced the huge number of boilerplate codes that you used to write, everything is gone now. Just use Redux toolkit and it's just few lines of code and your Redux will be set up. So for those of you who are watching this video and you are new to Redux, you are entering at a very great time. Since we are using Redux toolkits, it's very easy to use. You just have to create a slice and a store. So what store is, I'll explain you with an example. So suppose I have an application where there are multiple parts. One part is creating the data of users. One part, so it's an e-commerce website, let's say. One part is keeping the data of all the products that I have. So all these are different from each other. So let's say these are slices that I have inside my application. And what is store? Store is a container which keeps all the slices. So for each of the entity that I have, I'll create a slice and I'll keep that slice inside a store. So slice is basically a wrapper function around my reducer and actions. Now, what is reducer and what is actions? For those of you who are new to Redux, actions are the functions that we call to update our store. Similarly, Redux just updates our store, and for my entire UI, the state will be updated automatically. So this might be a little confusing just whenever I'm saying it verbally, but once we start using it, you'll see how simple it is to use Redux. So now that I have installed Redux, I'll go to tutorial overview. I'll just go to quick start. As you can see, we just need two things. One is a slice and one is our store. So also we need to install React Redux apart from toolkit into our application. So I'll again paste this command. Okay, it's done. So now that it's done, I'll again run my application npx react native run iOS. Now, meanwhile, this is building the application. I'll go to my Redux folder. Okay, so it started. That was very fast actually. So I'll go to Redux. We need two folders, as I told you. One is slice and the other is a store. So, and for slice, I'll just create. So now we need to have a slice for each of the logic that for each of the component, or say each of the product that I have. Since this application is working around trips and nothing else, so for this particular application, I'll just have one slice called trips.js. But let's say if you're building an e-commerce application, you need to have more than one slice. One should be a user slice, one should be a product slide, one should be a seller slice, a lot of slices should be there. And for store, I'll just create a file called index.js, because in every application there should be only one store. So you can have multiple stores depending on the use cases, but in this application I'm having only one store. So in this slice, it's so let's say const initial state. Initial state is the very beginning of whatever the values that we are going to have. Initial state. So instead of giving it a generic name, let's say initial trips state, since we can have more than one trip. So initial trip state will be an object where trips will be an empty array, which means we don't have any trips yet. So trips is just basically a collection of objects inside an array. According to my data structure, you can organize your data in any way that you want. I like using arrays a lot, so I'll keep all of my trips inside an array. So let's start building the slice. So I'll say export const trip slice. So this trip slice, for this we have to call create slice from Redux toolkit. Now this will accept few arguments parameter. You can say here the first one is to what is the name that we are going to give it. So let's give it a name of trips. So as you can see, this is the name of our slice, which is trips. Second thing is initial state. What is going to be the initial state of this application, of this slice? So I'll say the initial state is initial trip state. For it might seem confusing, and again repeating, I'm not expecting you to understand it in one go, but just write whatever I'm writing and you'll understand. The more practice you'll have, you'll understand it better. It's very simple to use Redux here. So next up we have reducer. So earlier what we used to have multiple files, one for reducer, one for action, one for states and everything. But now we just need one slice and it will enclose all the logic for us. So inside our reducer, we just have to define our functions. So one function that I'm going to use is add trip. So for as I showed you in the application in the demo, that we can add a trip by just going to the form. So this is going to be a function which will take two things here. One is state. State is the this value. This is the initial state. So state will be holding all the values of my trip, and the second one is action. So action. Now action will contain certain parameters. One should be payload, what type of action it is, and so on. So remember, it takes two things, state and action. So, and you can now update the state here, state dot trips. So this is the trips that I'm updating, this array. Now this is going to be like I'll just say update my array. So I'm using spread operator here. Let's say whatever the previous value of my trips was, just copy this as it is, and apart from this add whatever value I'm passing. Let's say action dot payload. So what I'll do is, so understand it this way, that whenever I'll call add trip, it will be something like this here, add trip, and I'll pass an object. Let's say id 1, place India, country India. So as you can see, this particular object is my payload. So what I'm saying, that add this particular payload inside my trips array by copying the previous values. So this will update my state. So this is how I'll add a trip to my reducer. Now for every trip, I can add some expenses. So what I'll say, add expenses, add expense. Since at a time I'll be using only one expense. So I'll just copy this line again. First is state and the other one is action. By copying this state and action, I'll say, now I might have multiple trips, and for each of the trip I might be adding an expense. So what kind of payload I'll be passing this time, I'll just quickly show you. Let's say add expense will be like this, and this will be an array. Inside the array there will be one property key value basically, which is trip ID. Let's say whatever is the trip ID. So whatever ID I am passing to this trip, I'll be passing to expense as well, so that I can identify, let's say this is some ID, and then we will have expense, which will again be an object, which will be again have an ID. So this is the expense ID and this is the trip ID. This is to map an expense with its trip. So this will make sure that I'm adding the expense to the right trip. It's not like that I added an expense for Manali trip and it is added to Goa trip. So that's why we need to pass trip ID as well. So inside add expense, what I'll do, I'll just delete it quickly. Inside add expense, I'll say, I'll extract the trip ID. Trip ID is equal to action dot payload dot trip ID. So this will now extract the trip ID that I have. Now I just have to update my state like this. So what I'll say, state dot trips is equal to whatever the current value of my state dot trip is. State dot trip is state dot trips dot map. So map is a function, a prototype function that we have for our arrays. So this will take our first individual element. So it's an iterator basically. This takes out each element inside an array and then operates on it whatever kind of operation we want. So for this, I want that if my trip dot id, which means this trip's id matches with the trip id that I have, trip id. If this matches, just do one thing: trip dot expenses, update this array to be like this. Spread the previous expenses that we have, expenses, and add whatever new expense I'm passing, action dot payload dot expense. So and then return the trip as it is. So what map does, map returns an array of array by operating on an array. So suppose there is an array of 1 2 3. Now this is an array, let's say. So this is core JavaScript concept basically. So this is an array. Now if I say b is equal to a dot map, and for each of the number that we have, you can call it anything: num, item, trip, abcd, alphabet, Eiffel Tower, anything that you want. And now this will return something. So if I'll say num plus 1, so what will be the value of b? Now b will become 2 3 4. So what this did, it individually picked up the element and added 1 to it. I'm sorry. So this is the kind of operation that we get from map. So now here, as you can see, my slice is created. So this is the function to add an expense, and this is the function to add a trip. Again, just go through the code once, understand it line by line, then only you'll understand Redux if you're using it for the first time. I'll just go through it once. So for add trip, I'll just pass a payload, which will be a trip itself. I'll show it again. It will be like this. Let's say an ID for my trip, place value, which will be, let's say, Manali, country value, which will be, let's say, India. This should be enclosed inside this. And finally, expenses, which is by default initially an empty array. So this is the payload that I'll be passing inside this. So this will get added to my array. So what my trips will be just a collection of these objects. Let's say collection of these objects, and this will be wrapped inside an array. So this is the kind of trips that I'll have. It's a collection of objects. Now similarly, whenever I'm adding an expense, what I'm doing is, let's say the trip ID that I passed was 233. So this function will find this particular object, and for this object, for the expenses, it will add the new expense that I'm passing to this array. So these are the two functions that we have. Now we just have to export this function from the slice. So let's export const. So the first one is add expense and the second one is add trip from trip slice dot actions. So these two functions are exported so that we can use it further. And the next thing that by default we need to export is the reducer. Export default, the reducer that we have, which is trip slice dot reducer. So that's it. This is one file that you have to create for every for every section in your application. So again, I'll repeat the example of e-commerce website. So you have to create a slice like this for your user, you have to create a slice like this for your products, for your seller, and so on. But since my application is just based on trips, my entire slice is created in just 28 lines of code. Now if I go to store, for my store, what I'll have to do is I'll have to call a function called configure store. So I'll create a variable here, export const store, and we have to call a function here configure store. Now configure store will again take an object. The key will be reducers. So you can have multiple reducers here, whatever reducer you want. I need just one, which is trips and which is trip reducer. And I'll have to import this here. So I'll import it, import trip trip reducer from, just go back to slice and then trips. That's it, done. So as you can see, my store is also created. This is all that you have to do to integrate Redux into your application. So people get overwhelmed when they hear about Redux, that it's very complicated, the boilerplate is very large, it's very complex to use. It's none of them. As you can see, I just integrated Redux into files. Now we just have to do one thing. Inside our app.js, we have to wrap entire application inside our store. So for that, what we will do is we have something called provider. I'll wrap everything inside provider and I'll pass the store here. Store. I'll import the store and done. So Redux through reducer is a required argument. Okay, I guess there is some spelling mistake here. Reducers. So I guess it's a reducer only here. I'll just quickly check this once. So here is some error, which is, yes, it's not reducers, it's reducer only. So that's it. So your Redux is integrated in this part of the video. As you can see, it was fairly simple to integrate Redux. Just go through this video once more. If you have any doubt, do comment it out. I'll surely clear your doubt, and I'll see you in the next part of the tutorial where I'll start screen designing for an application. So that's it. That's all about integrating Redux into a store. Thank you.